December 22, 1942, Rostock-Mariana Airfield, northern Germany. The winter sky hung gray and heavy over the frozen grass runway, where a dozen men in long leather coats stamped their feet against the cold. They were officials from the Reich's Luftfahrtministerium, the Reich Air Ministry, men who controlled the destiny of every aircraft in the German arsenal. They had come to witness a demonstration that should have changed everything. At the end of the runway sat two aircraft. One was familiar, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the deadliest fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory, capable of 400 miles per hour, the machine that had terrorized RAF pilots over the Channel. The other was something else entirely, sleek, twin-tailed, no propeller visible anywhere on its fuselage. In place of a conventional engine, two cylindrical pods hung beneath wings that seemed almost too delicate for the massive nacelles they carried. The Henkel HE-280. What happened in the next 15 minutes should have rewritten the future of aerial warfare. The two aircraft took off and flew an oval course above the airfield, a mock dogfight designed to demonstrate the jet's capabilities. The HE-280 completed 4 full laps before the FW-190 could finish 3. 4 laps. The piston-engine fighter, the best Germany had, wasn't even close. The RLM officials watched in silence. They had just witnessed a technological demonstration that proved beyond all doubt that jet propulsion could defeat conventional aircraft in combat, that the future had arrived 3 years ahead of schedule. Germany possessed, at that moment, the most advanced fighter aircraft on Earth. 3 months later, they killed it. On March 27, 1943, Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, signed an order canceling the HE-280 program. The world's first jet fighter, the aircraft that had humiliated Germany's best propeller-driven machine in front of senior officials, was abandoned. The reasoning given was bureaucratic. The overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. The decision would cost Germany the war in the air. It would cost the Luftwaffe thousands of pilots. It would give the Allies the time they needed to develop their own jets, to perfect long-range escort fighters, to reduce German cities to rubble while Messerschmitt scrambled to catch up with a head start Henkel had handed them on a silver platter. This is the story of how politics, ego, and institutional blindness murdered the greatest opportunity Nazi Germany ever had. How a visionary aircraft designer was sabotaged by the very men who should have championed his work. How the first jet fighter in history flew, proved itself in combat conditions, and then was systematically strangled in its cradle. It could have changed everything. So why did Germany abandon it? To understand how the HE-280 came to exist and how it came to die, you must first understand the man who created it. Ernst Henkel was not like other German aircraft manufacturers. Born in 1888 in Grunbach, he had built his first aircraft at age 23 and survived a crash that nearly killed him. The experience left him with a permanent limp and an obsession with speed that bordered on mania. While other designers prioritized reliability or armament or range, Henkel wanted velocity above all else. His aircraft consistently pushed the boundaries of what was aerodynamically possible. By the mid-1930s, Henkel's company had established itself as one of Germany's premier aviation manufacturers. But the relationship between Henkel and the Nazi leadership was complicated from the start. Unlike Willy Messerschmitt, who cultivated powerful friendships within the party, Henkel remained at arm's length from the political machinery that controlled military procurement. He was a businessman and an engineer, not a politician. This distinction would prove fatal to his most important creation. In 1935, a young physicist named Hans Joachim Pobst von Ohain, arrived at the University of Göttingen with an idea that would revolutionize aviation. Von Ohain had been working on gas turbine propulsion, the theoretical foundation for what would become the jet engine. His concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of using pistons and propellers to generate thrust, a turbine would compress air, mix it with fuel, ignite the mixture, and expel the resulting gases at tremendous velocity. No propeller, no reciprocating engine, pure reactive thrust. The physics were sound. The engineering was nightmarishly complex. Von Ohain needed resources. He needed manufacturing capability. He needed someone willing to bet everything on an unproven technology. In 1936, Hugo von Pohl, director of the Physical Institute at Göttingen, wrote a letter to Ernst Haenkel describing his student's work. Haenkel responded immediately. Within months, von Ohain and his assistant Max Hahn had relocated to Haenkel's facility at Marianne Airfield outside Rostock. They brought with them a crude prototype engine that ran on hydrogen gas. Dangerous, impractical, but proof that the concept worked. Haenkel provided unlimited funding, engineering support, and something equally valuable: absolute secrecy. The Reich Air Ministry knew nothing of what was being developed in the workshops at Marianne. By September 1937, von Ohain had demonstrated his first functional turbojet engine, designated the Heinkel HES-1. It produced 550 pounds of thrust, modest by later standards, but revolutionary for its time. Work began immediately on a flight-capable version. The timeline that followed represented one of the most remarkable achievements in aviation history. In less than 2 years, Heinkel's team designed and built an entirely new category of aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178, a small, sleek test bed with a single turbojet buried in its fuselage, took shape in the hangars at Marianne. Test pilot Erich Vorsitz, one of the few men Heinkel trusted with his secret project, familiarized himself with the controls of an aircraft unlike anything that had ever existed. On August 27, 1939, 4 days before Germany invaded Poland and ignited the Second World War, Vorsitz climbed into the cockpit of the Heinkel HE-178 and became the first human being to fly solely under jet power. The flight lasted only minutes. The landing gear failed to retract, limiting speed. But the implications were staggering. In one leap, Heinkel had vaulted past every aircraft manufacturer on Earth. The Heinkel HE-178 represented the future of aviation, compressed into a single morning's work over a German airfield. Heinkel immediately requested a demonstration for senior Luftwaffe officials. On November 1, 1939, the HE-178 flew before Ernst Udet, head of aircraft procurement, and Erhard Milch, state secretary of the Air Ministry. Both men were pilots. Both had combat experience. Both should have recognized what they were seeing. They were unimpressed. The Heinkel HE-178's maximum speed of 372 miles per hour was slower than contemporary piston fighters. Its range was pathetically short. The fuel consumption of early jet engines was voracious. The engine itself was temperamental, prone to flameouts and overheating. Udet and Milch saw a curiosity, not a weapon. They saw problems to be solved, not a breakthrough to be exploited. What they missed was equally significant. The Heinkel HE-178 was a test bed, a proof of concept, not a production fighter. Its purpose was to demonstrate that jet propulsion worked. The performance limitations were engineering challenges, not fundamental barriers. With proper development, With the resources of the Reich Air Ministry behind it, those problems could have been solved in months, not years. But neither Udet nor Milch authorized significant funding. They were turned to Berlin convinced that jet propulsion was interesting, but premature. The conventional air war was going well. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland in weeks. France would fall the following spring. There was no urgency to pursue radical new technologies when existing aircraft were winning battles across Europe. Heinkel was devastated, but not defeated. If the Reich Air Ministry wouldn't fund jet development, he would do it himself. Even as the Ecce 178 gathered dust in a hangar at Marinia, Heinkel's engineers were already working on something far more ambitious. The test bed had proven that jets could fly. Now they needed to prove that jets could fight. The project began in late 1939 under the designation Ecce 180, later changed to Ecce 280. The design requirements were straightforward. Create a single-seat fighter capable of engaging and destroying enemy aircraft using jet propulsion. Everything else was negotiable. Robert Lesser, a German aeronautical engineer who had previously worked at Messerschmitt, led the design team. His approach was deliberately conservative. The Ecce 280 would not attempt to revolutionize fighter design in addition to its propulsion system. The fuselage followed conventional Heinkel practice. The wings were semi-elliptical, similar to patterns that had proven effective on piston fighters. The twin-tail configuration provided stability without requiring exotic engineering. What made the Ecce 280 revolutionary was its integration of multiple cutting-edge technologies into a single airframe. Two turbojet engines, mounted in the cells beneath the wings, would provide thrust. A tricycle undercarriage, extremely rare for fighters of the era, would allow the aircraft to take off without the ground loop tendencies that plagued tail-dragging designs. And in the cockpit, Lesser's team installed something that had never existed on any aircraft before: a compressed air-powered ejection seat. The ejection seat was not an afterthought. Lesser and Heinkel understood that jet engines would push aircraft to speeds where conventional bailout procedures became impossible. At 400 miles per hour, opening a canopy and climbing out of a cockpit was suicide. The slipstream would tear a pilot apart. The only solution was to blast him clear of the aircraft entirely, then let a parachute handle the rest. The mechanism was elegant. The pilot sat on a seat mounted to rails running up and along the cockpit spine. Behind the seat, a cylinder of compressed air waited under enormous pressure. In an emergency, the pilot would jettison the canopy, pull a lever, and the seat would rocket upward, carrying him clear of the tail surfaces. Once free of the aircraft, he would release his harness and deploy his parachute normally. No one knew if it would work. No one had ever tried it. By the summer of 1940, the first Heinkel 280 prototype airframe was complete. It sat in the hangar at WWII, looking almost aggressive, low-slung, purposeful, utterly unlike the portly bombers and angular fighters that filled German airfields. But it couldn't fly. The Heinkel HES-8 turbojet engines that were supposed to power it had encountered severe development problems. Thrust was inadequate. Reliability was non-existent. The engines leaked fuel and overheated under sustained operation. Heinkel refused to wait. On September 22, 1940, the Heinkel 280 V1 prototype was fitted with ballasted dummy pods in place of its engines and towed into the air behind a Heinkel HE-111 bomber. Test pilot Fritz Schaefer put the aircraft through its paces as a glider, evaluating handling characteristics, control response, and general airworthiness. The results were promising. The airframe was sound. 6 months later, on March 30th, 1941, the wait ended. Schaefer climbed into the cockpit of the second prototype, the Heinkel 280 V2, fitted with two HES-8A engines producing roughly 1,100 pounds of thrust each. The engines ran without their cowlings, the heat problems remained unsolved, and exposed engines could at least be monitored for signs of failure. At 7:30 in the morning, Schaefer released the brakes and rolled down the runway. The Heinkel 280 lifted off and climbed into the spring sky over Rostock. The world's first purpose-built jet fighter was airborne. Schaefer's report after landing was cautiously optimistic. The aircraft was somewhat difficult to control during turns. The twin engines created asymmetric thrust effects that required constant compensation. But the raw performance was undeniable. Speed, climb rate, and acceleration all exceeded anything possible with piston engines. An experienced pilot, Schaefer concluded, would have no trouble mastering the Heinkel 280. 5 days later, on April 5, 1941, pilot Paul Bader demonstrated the Heinkel 280 before a delegation of Nazi officials, including Ernst Udet. The aircraft performed flawlessly, climbing and maneuvering with obvious superiority over the piston fighters that accompanied it. This time, Udet's reaction was more positive. He authorized Heinkel to continue development and promised that jet technology would receive increased attention. The promise meant nothing. Unknown to Heinkel, the Reich Air Ministry had already begun its own jet development program in secret. BMW and Junkers were both working on axial flow turbojets, a different design philosophy from von Ohein's centrifugal engines. The RLM had no intention of allowing Heinkel to dominate jet aviation. They wanted competition. They wanted alternatives. And they had a favored manufacturer waiting in the wings. Willy Messerschmitt had submitted his own jet fighter design to the RLM in June 1939, the same month Heinkel's HE-178 first flew. The project, designated P-1065 and later ME-262, was more ambitious than the Heinkel 280 in some respects: swept wings, heavier armament, greater speed potential. It was also years behind Heinkel in actual development. When the Heinkel 280 made its first powered flight in March 1941, the ME-262 was still incapable of flying under jet power. Its engines didn't work. This should have settled the matter. The Heinkel 280 existed. The ME-262 did not. In wartime, production capability trumps theoretical performance every time. A working aircraft today is worth infinitely more than a better aircraft that might exist in 2 years. But the RLM saw things differently. Messerschmitt was politically connected. Heinkel was not. And in the Third Reich, politics determined procurement far more than performance. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, development of the Heinkel 280 continued in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. Heinkel received enough funding to keep the program alive, but not enough to accelerate it toward production. The engine problems persisted. The HES-8 never achieved the thrust levels von Ohein had promised, and reliability remained poor. Heinkel explored alternative plant products: the BMW 003, the Junkers Jumo 004, but these engines had problems of their own. Then, on November 17, 1941, everything changed. Ernst Udet shot himself in the head while on the telephone with his girlfriend. The official announcement claimed that Udet had died while testing a new weapon. The truth, that Germany's head of aircraft procurement had committed suicide under the pressure of a war he knew was unwinnable, was concealed from the public. On his bed, Written in red pencil, Udet had left two messages. One read, "Ingelaine, why have you left me?" addressed to his girlfriend. The other read, "Iron One, you are responsible for my death." Iron One was Hermann Göring. Udet's death threw the Luftwaffe's procurement system into chaos. His replacement, Erhard Milch, inherited a portfolio of delayed programs, canceled projects, and broken promises. Among the problems Milch inherited was the question of what to do about jet fighters. The Heinkel 280 had been flying for nearly a year. 9 prototypes were in various stages of completion, but the program had no clear path to production. Engine development had stalled. Political support was lukewarm, and Messerschmitt was loudly promising that the Me-262, once its engine problems were solved, would outperform anything Heinkel could build. Milch was skeptical of both programs. He was a conservative administrator who preferred proven technologies over experimental ones. The war was being fought with Bf-109s and Fw-190s, aircraft that worked. Why divert resources to jets that might not function reliably for years? Heinkel understood that his program was dying. He needed a demonstration so dramatic, so impossible to ignore, that even the most skeptical bureaucrat would have to take notice. In late 1942, he arranged exactly that. The mock dogfight of December 22, 1942, was designed to settle the question once and for all. The HE-280 V3 prototype, fitted with improved HES-8 engines, would compete directly against an Fw-190, the Luftwaffe's best operational fighter. RLM officials would observe. Performance would be measured. There would be no more speculation about theoretical capabilities. The aircraft would prove itself in the air. The Fw-190 that showed up that morning was not a production model. It was a specially tuned aircraft, as fast as any propeller fighter in existence, flown by an experienced test pilot who knew its capabilities intimately. The demonstration was not designed to be easy. What followed was a humiliation. The two aircraft took off and began flying an oval course above the airfield. The HE-280 pulled away immediately, its jets producing thrust that no piston engine could match. By the end of the first lap, the gap was significant. By the end of the second, it was embarrassing. The Fw-190 pilot pushed his aircraft to its limits, full throttle, optimal altitude, perfect technique. It made no difference. When the HE-280 crossed the finish line after 4 complete laps, the Fw-190 was still completing its third. The jet had won by 33%. In a single demonstration, the HE-280 had proven that jet propulsion could defeat any piston engine fighter in existence. Not in theory, not in simulations, in actual flight, witnessed by the men who controlled German aviation procurement. The RLM officials were finally impressed. Within weeks, they placed an order for 20 pre-production HE-280 aircraft, to be followed by a full production run of 300 fighters. The program appeared to be saved. It was already too late. The production order for the HE-280 came with a fatal condition. The aircraft would not be powered by Heinkel's HES-8 engines. The RLM had ordered Heinkel to abandon development of both the HES-8 and its successor, the HES-30, in favor of concentrating all resources on a new power plant, the HES-011. The HES-011 was a next-generation engine, more powerful and efficient than anything currently flying. It was also years from completion. By ordering Heinkel to wait for an engine that didn't exist, the RLM had effectively frozen the HE-280 program in place. The alternative was to use engines developed by other companies. The BMW 003 showed promise, but was plagued by its own reliability problems. The Junkers Jumo 004 was further along in development, but was significantly larger and heavier than the engines the HE-280 had been designed to carry. In early 1943, Heinkel decided to test the HE-280 with Jumo 004 engines. The results were predictable. The larger, heavier power plants destroyed the aircraft's carefully balanced performance characteristics. The HE-280 became sluggish, less maneuverable, and, crucially, slower than the Messerschmitt Me-262 equipped with the same engines. The Me-262 had been designed from the start for larger engines. Its swept wings and longer fuselage accommodated the Jumo 004 without significant compromise. The HE-280, built around smaller power plants, became a different aircraft entirely when forced to carry engines it was never meant to use. On March 16, 1943, the HE-280 V2 prototype flew for the first time with Jumo 004 engines. Test pilots reported that handling had degraded significantly. Speed was below expectations. The aircraft that had humiliated an FW-190 3 months earlier now struggled to demonstrate any clear advantage over it. 11 days later, on March 27, 1943, Erhard Milch signed the termination order. His letter to Ernst Heinkel was brief and bureaucratic. The overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. The HE-280 program was canceled. Heinkel was ordered to redirect his company's resources toward bomber development. The 9 prototype aircraft would continue to be used for research purposes, but no production would occur. The decision was justified on technical grounds. The Me-262, when equipped with Jumo 004 engines, was faster than the HE-280. It had a greater range. It carried heavier armament, 4 30mm cannon compared to the HE-280's planned 3 20mm guns. On paper, the Messerschmitt was the superior fighter. But paper performance meant nothing if the aircraft didn't exist. And in March 1943, the Me-262 was still not operational. Engine problems continued to plague the program. Test aircraft were crashing at alarming rates. Production facilities were months away from completion. The HE-280, by contrast, had been flying for 2 years. Its airframe was proven. Its systems were understood. Its manufacturing requirements were documented. With proper engine support, it could have been in squadron service within months. Instead, Germany chose to wait. The consequences of that decision would not become fully apparent until the following year, when waves of American bombers began reducing German cities to ash, while the Luftwaffe's fighter force proved helpless to stop them. January 13, 1942, 1 year before the HE-280's cancellation, test pilot Helmut Schenk was strapped into the cockpit of the HE-280 prototype, 7,875 feet above the Reuchlin Test Center in northern Germany. The aircraft was being towed by a pair of Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters, part of a test series to evaluate pulse jet engines for the V-1 flying bomb program. The HE-280's turbojet engines had been removed and replaced with Argus AS-014 pulse jets, the same power plant that would later propel Hitler's vengeance weapons toward London. Heavy snow was falling. The temperature was well below freezing, and something was wrong. Schenk noticed it first in the controls. The stick felt heavy, unresponsive. He pushed the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. Ice had formed on the control surfaces during the climb, freezing the cables solid. The Heinkel 280 was still attached to its tow aircraft, flying straight and level, but Schenk had no ability to control it once released. He jettisoned the tow line and tried the controls again. The aircraft began to descend in a gentle spiral, completely unresponsive to his inputs. He had perhaps 2 minutes before impact. Schenk reached down and grasped the lever that activated the ejection seat. No pilot had ever used such a device in an actual emergency. The mechanism had been tested on the ground, fired with dummies, evaluated by engineers. But no one knew if it would work in a real aircraft, at real altitude, with a real human being's life depending on its function. Schenk pulled the lever. The canopy blew off. A fraction of a second later, compressed air slammed into the bottom of his seat with several G-forces of acceleration. Schenk rocketed clear of the spiraling aircraft, tumbling briefly in the freezing air before releasing his harness and deploying his parachute. He landed safely in a snow-covered field. The Heinkel 280 crashed minutes later and was never recovered. Helmut Schenk had just become the first human being in history to use an ejection seat in an emergency. The technology worked. The pilot lived. The aircraft had sacrificed itself to prove that escape from a disabled jet was possible. This single incident encapsulated everything that made the Heinkel 280 special. The aircraft was not just fast. It was not just a technological curiosity. It was designed with the understanding that jet aviation would require entirely new approaches to pilot safety, aircraft handling, and combat tactics. Every element of the design reflected this understanding. The tricycle landing gear eliminated the ground loop accidents that killed dozens of pilots in conventional tail-dragging fighters. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy. If one jet failed, the aircraft could still fly on the other. The ejection seat meant that pilots could survive situations that would have been fatal in any other aircraft of the era. These features mattered because the Heinkel 280 was designed to be mass-produced and flown by average pilots, not just by elite test crews. Ernst Heinkel understood that a weapons system is only as effective as its ability to be replicated and deployed. A handful of prototype aircraft meant nothing. Thousands of production fighters, flowing from factories to airfields across occupied Europe, meant everything. By the time the program was canceled in March 1943, Heinkel had developed complete production plans for the Heinkel 280. The aircraft could have been manufactured in existing facilities with minimal retooling. Pilot training programs had been drafted. Maintenance procedures had been documented. The Heinkel 280 was ready for war. The war was not ready for the Heinkel 280. Why did Germany abandon its most promising fighter aircraft? The technical arguments made by Erhard Milch were not entirely without merit. The Me-262, when finally perfected, would indeed prove faster and better armed than the Heinkel 280. But technical arguments alone do not explain the decision. The RLM had access to both programs. They could have continued developing the Heinkel 280 as an interim solution while the Me-262 reached maturity. They chose not to. The answer lies in the poisonous politics of the Third Reich. Erhard Heinkel was never fully accepted by the Nazi leadership. He was a businessman in an era when ideological purity mattered more than competence. He had refused to join the Nazi Party until late in the regime's existence, and even then his membership was largely nominal. He employed Jewish workers in his factories long after other manufacturers had expelled them. He maintained contacts with foreign aviation companies that the security services found suspicious. Illy Messerschmitt, by contrast, was a political insider. He had cultivated relations with senior Nazi figures throughout the 1930s. His company received preferential treatment in contract negotiations. When problems arose with Messerschmitt designs, and problems frequently arose, they were smoothed over through political channels rather than exposed to technical scrutiny. The competition between Heinkel and Messerschmitt was not primarily about aircraft. It was about power, influence, and access to the decision-makers who controlled German military procurement. In this contest, Heinkel was hopelessly outmatched. Aviation historians Tim Heath and Robert Dorr have documented how Heinkel's declining favor with Nazi leadership directly influenced the Heinkel Pu-80's cancellation. The decision was not made in a vacuum. It reflected years of accumulated grievances, political maneuvering, and institutional bias against a manufacturer who refused to play by the regime's rules. There was also the matter of the Heinkel 177. Heinkel's other major program of the early 1940s was the Heinkel 177 Greif, a four-engine heavy bomber designed to give Germany strategic bombing capability comparable to the British Lancaster or American B-17. The aircraft was plagued by catastrophic problems from the start. Its coupled engines, two engines driving a single propeller shaft, had a tendency to catch fire in flight. Air crews called it the flying lighter. Production aircraft crashed at appalling rates. The Heinkel HE-177 debacle consumed enormous resources and produced a weapon system that was never operationally effective. It also destroyed what remained of Heinkel's reputation within the RLM. By 1943, the Air Ministry viewed Heinkel as a manufacturer of failed promises, not functional aircraft. The HE-280's genuine achievements could not overcome this perception. The final factor was timing. When the HE-280 program was canceled, Germany was still winning the war. Stalingrad had just fallen, true, but the Eastern Front remained contested. The Allied bombing campaign against German industry had not yet reached its devastating peak. The Luftwaffe still controlled significant portions of European airspace. In this environment, patience seemed reasonable. Why rush a revolutionary new fighter into production when existing aircraft were performing adequately? Why accept the compromises of the HE-280 when the MiG-262 promised superior performance in just a few more months of development? The answers to these questions would become apparent in 1944, when a few more months stretched into a year, when American bombers began appearing over Germany in numbers that overwhelmed defensive fighters, when the window for jet aviation to make a difference began closing with terrifying speed. By then, it was too late. The Messerschmitt MiG-262 did not enter operational service until July 1944, more than 3 years after the HE-280 first flew under jet power. By that time, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Allied bombers were striking German industry around the clock. The 8th Air Force had introduced the P-51 Mustang, an escort fighter capable of accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Luftwaffe pilot losses had reached unsustainable levels. Training programs had collapsed under fuel shortages and constant attack. The average German fighter pilot entering combat in 1944 had fewer than 100 hours of flight time. His American counterpart had over 400. The Messerschmitt MiG-262, when it finally appeared, was everything its designers had promised. Fast, heavily armed, capable of slashing through bomber formations with devastating effect. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was nearly unstoppable. American fighter pilots learned to fear the distinctive whistle of approaching jets, the speed that made interception almost impossible, the 4 30mm cannon that could tear a B-17 apart in seconds. But there weren't enough of them. There were never enough. Production of the MiG-262 was plagued by shortages of critical materials, Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities, and Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be developed as a fighter-bomber rather than a pure interceptor. By war's end, approximately 1,400 MiG-262s had been delivered to the Luftwaffe. Fewer than 300 were ever operational at any one time. The numbers that matter are starker. The Allied bomber offensive against Germany dropped 1.44 million tons of bombs between 1943 and 1945. German industrial production was reduced by an estimated 50%. Over 600,000 German civilians died in the bombing. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces. Most of those losses occurred in 1944 and 1945, after the window for effective jet deployment had closed. If the HE-280 had entered service in 1942, if even a few hundred of the aircraft had been available when the American bombing campaign began, the entire trajectory of the air war might have changed. This is not speculation. The mathematics are straightforward. In December 1942, the HE-280 demonstrated that it could outperform the best piston fighter in the Luftwaffe by 33%. American bombers of that era were defended by aircraft no better than the FW-190. The heavy bombers themselves cruised at approximately 200 miles per hour and were dependent on defensive formations for protection against fighter attack. A jet fighter capable of 500 miles per hour against targets moving at 200 miles per hour possesses an almost insurmountable tactical advantage. Interception becomes trivially easy. Escape becomes impossible. The bomber formations that devastated German cities in 1944 and 1945 would have been slaughtered in 1943 against even a modest force of operational jets. The HE-280 could have been that force. It was designed for rapid production. It was proven in flight testing. It required only engines that worked reliably, engines that Germany was already developing, engines that would eventually power the MiG-262 to its limited successes. Instead, Germany waited. The HE-280 was canceled. The MiG-262 took 3 more years to reach combat. And in those 3 years, the Allies built the air power that would ensure Nazi Germany's defeat. Ernst Heinkel survived the war, but never recovered from the cancellation of the HE-280. In his memoirs, published in 1953, he described the decision as the most bitter defeat of his career. He had offered Germany the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The RLM had rejected it in favor of a competitor's design that was years behind in development. The personal and political factors that influenced the decision haunted him for the rest of his life. He wrote, "We had the future in our hands. They threw it away because they preferred Messerschmitt's promises to our reality." The 9 HE-280 prototypes that survived the program's cancellation were used for various research purposes throughout 1943 and 1944. Some tested experimental engine configurations. Others were converted to gliders for aerodynamic research. By war's end, all had been destroyed or captured by Allied forces. Hans von Ohain, the physicist whose work made jet propulsion possible, was brought to the United States after the war under Operation Paperclip. He spent the rest of his career at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, contributing to American jet engine development and earning recognition as one of the pioneers of aviation. In 1991, he and Sir Frank Whittle, the British engineer who independently developed jet propulsion, were jointly awarded the Charles Stark Draper Prize for their contributions to technology. The two men had never met during the war. Their work had proceeded in parallel, each unaware of the other's progress, each racing to harness a technology that would transform warfare and civilian life. Whittle and engines powered the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter. Von Ohain's engines powered the He-280, the world's first jet fighter. Both deserved credit for launching the jet age. Willy Messerschmitt's reputation survived the war largely intact. The Me-262, despite its limited numbers and late deployment, became the iconic German jet fighter, the symbol of technological achievement that might have turned the tide. Messerschmitt was briefly imprisoned after the war for his involvement in the Nazi regime, but was released and continued designing aircraft until his death in 1978. Erhard Milch, the man who signed the He-280's death warrant, was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes related to the use of forced labor in German aircraft factories. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, later reduced to 15 years. He was released in 1954 and lived until 1972, never publicly expressing regret for the decision that killed the He-280. The He-280 holds a series of aviation records that are often overlooked in histories focused on the Me-262's combat career. It was the first jet fighter designed from the outset as a combat aircraft. The Gloster E-2839, which flew shortly after the He-280, was a technology demonstrator, not a weapon. The Me-262, which received most of the post-war attention, was years behind in development. The He-280 was purpose-built to fight. It was the first aircraft equipped with an ejection seat. Helmut Schenk's emergency escape on January 13, 1942, demonstrated that pilots could survive the failure of jet aircraft at high speeds. Every military jet since has incorporated some version of this technology. Millions of pilots have survived crashes that would have been fatal without ejection systems. The lineage traces directly back to Marigny Airfield. It was the first jet aircraft to fly with a tricycle undercarriage. This configuration, which places the nose wheel ahead of the main gear, eliminated the ground handling problems that plagued conventional fighters. Today, virtually every jet aircraft in the world uses tricycle landing gear. The He-280 pioneered the arrangement. It was the first jet aircraft to demonstrate clear superiority over piston-engine fighters in controlled conditions. The December 1942 mock dogfight was not a publicity stunt. It was a scientific demonstration of capability, observed by qualified officials, documented for the historical record. The results were unambiguous. Jet propulsion had arrived. These achievements were buried under the weight of what followed. The Me-262's combat record, however limited, overshadowed the He-280's developmental accomplishments. Histories of jet aviation jumped from the He-178's first flight to the Me-262's operational deployment, treating the He-280 as a footnote rather than the crucial intermediate step it actually was. The irony is that the Me-262 owed much of its success to lessons learned from the He-280 program. Engine integration, airframe design, pilot training requirements, and production planning all were informed by Heinkel's earlier work. The RLM canceled the He-280, but absorbed its innovations into the very program they used as justification for cancellation. While Germany debated which jet fighter to build, its enemies were racing to catch up. In Britain, Frank Whittle had been developing turbojet technology since the early 1930s. His approach differed from von Ohain's in significant ways: different compressor designs, different combustion chamber configurations, but the underlying physics were identical. By 1941, Whittle's engines were powering the Gloster E-2839 testbed, proving that British jet aviation was viable. The Gloster Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter, entered service in July 1944, the same month as the Me-262. The two aircraft never met in combat. The Meteor was used primarily for intercepting V-1 flying bombs over England, its speed advantage over the pulse jet-powered cruise missiles making it ideal for the role. In the United States, jet development proceeded more slowly. American manufacturers had access to Whittle's designs through a technology sharing agreement with Britain, and the Bell P-59 Aerocomet flew in October 1942. But the P-59 was a disappointment, slower than the best piston fighters and unsuitable for combat. It served only as a trainer and test bed. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first combat-capable jet, did not fly until January 1944 and did not reach operational units before the war ended. American air power in World War II remained entirely dependent on piston engines. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that destroyed the Luftwaffe were products of conventional technology, overwhelmingly manufactured and relentlessly deployed. This timeline reveals the magnitude of Germany's squandered opportunity. In March 1941, when the He-280 made its first powered flight, neither Britain nor the United States had a jet fighter even close to operational status. Germany possessed a lead at least 2 years, possibly 3. That lead was enough. In the context of total war, a 2-year head start in revolutionary technology could have been decisive. Jet fighters deployed in 1942 would have met Allied bomber formations without escort coverage, without tactics developed to counter high-speed attack, without any effective defense. The 8th Air Force did not begin major operations over Germany until 1943. The combined bomber offensive that shattered German industry reached full intensity only in 1944. During this period, American planners accepted loss rates that would have been unsustainable if German defenses had included jet interceptors. A single squadron of HE-280s, 12 aircraft flown by experienced pilots, could have destroyed a dozen bombers per mission. Losses at that level, sustained over months, would have forced the Allies to reconsider their entire strategic approach. The daylight bombing campaign might have been abandoned. The invasion of France might have been delayed. The war might have lasted years longer. Instead, Germany canceled the HE-280 and spent those precious years developing the Me-262. By the time jets finally reached combat, the outcome was already determined. Germany had lost control of its skies. Its factories were burning. Its pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. The opportunity was gone. After the war, Allied intelligence teams swept across Germany, collecting documents, prototypes, and prisoners. The technology captured in those months would shape aviation for decades. Swept wings, jet engines, ejection seats, guided missiles, all had been developed in the desperate final years of the Reich, many too late to affect the war's outcome. Among the materials we covered were extensive files on the HE-280 program. American engineers studied Heinkel's designs with admiration and frustration. The aircraft could have worked, the technology was sound, the production plans were realistic. The only thing missing was institutional support. Major General Donald Wilson, interviewing captured Luftwaffe officers for the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, asked repeatedly about jet fighter deployment. The answers followed a consistent pattern: political interference, resource conflicts, divided authority, wasted time. Oberstleutnant Hermann Buchner, a staff officer in the fighter command, summarized the German failure in terms that could have come from Heinkel himself. "We had the aircraft, we had the pilots, we had the factories. What we lacked was the wisdom to use them before it was too late. Every month we delayed was a month the enemy used to grow stronger. By 1944, even 1,000 jets could not have saved us. In 1942, even 100 might have been enough." The human cost of this failure defies precise calculation. The Allied bombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The air war killed tens of thousands of pilots on both sides. The destruction of German industry prolonged the war on the ground, adding to the millions who died in the final year of fighting. None of this was inevitable. The technology to prevent it existed. A decision made differently in March 1943 could have produced a cascade of alternate outcomes, each branching into futures that never occurred. This is the burden of historical judgment. We know what happened. We cannot know what might have happened instead. But we can examine the decisions that shaped events and ask whether they reflected wisdom or folly, foresight or blindness, strategy or politics. In the case of the HE-280, the evidence is clear. Germany possessed the world's first jet fighter and chose to abandon it. The reasons were political, not technical. The consequences were catastrophic. The last HE-280 took to the air sometime in 1944. Records of the flight are incomplete. The aircraft was likely one of the surviving prototypes, pressed into service as a test bed for some experimental system now forgotten. The pilot's name is lost to history. The purpose of the mission is unknown. What we know is this. By that time, American bombers flew over Germany in formations of 1,000 aircraft. Escort fighters swarmed above and below them, ready to pounce on any defender that approached. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging pilots at a rate of several hundred per month. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that could have otherwise fought. Training programs had collapsed. The strategic situation was hopeless. Somewhere in that chaos, an HE-280 prototype flew its final mission. Then it landed, or crashed, or was destroyed on the ground by strafing fighters. The details don't matter. What matters is that it was never given the chance to matter. The HE-280 was not a failure. It was a murder victim, killed by politics, by ego, by institutional incompetence, killed by men who preferred promises over performance, who trusted connections over competence, who valued loyalty over results. Ernst Heinkel built the future. The Reich Air Ministry buried it. On August 27, 1939, Erich Warsitz became the first human to fly under jet power. His brief flight over Marienhay Airfield opened an era that would transform warfare, commerce, and daily life. Every passenger jet, every military fighter, every spacecraft that uses jet-derived technology traces its lineage to that moment. The HE-280 was the next step, the step Germany refused to take. 14 months of development, 9 prototypes built, 37 test flights completed, 1 ejection seat deployment that saved a pilot's life and proved the technology worked, 1 mock dogfight that demonstrated beyond doubt that jets could defeat the best piston fighters in existence. All of it thrown away for reasons that had nothing to do with aircraft and everything to do with power. The Me-262, the aircraft that replaced the HE-280, entered service too late to change the war's outcome. It claimed approximately 500 Allied aircraft in the final months of fighting. An impressive number against any measure except the one that matters. It was not enough. The window had closed. The He-280 could have opened that window 2 years earlier. 2 years of jet supremacy over Europe. 2 years of bomber formations shattered before they reached their targets. 2 years of Allied planners confronting a technology they had no answer for. Instead, Germany built 9 prototypes and filed them away. The flying milk bottles came anyway. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that should have been swept from the sky continued their work unmolested. German cities burned, German factories fell silent, German pilots died in their thousands, fighting a war they had already lost. In 1943, Germany possessed the most advanced fighter aircraft on Earth. In 1945, Germany possessed nothing. The jet age came. It came on American terms, in American time, with American industry producing aircraft faster than German pilots could be trained to face them. The He-280 represented a path not taken, a future that never arrived, a weapon that might have changed everything. It could have changed everything. So why did Germany abandon it? Because Ernst Heinkel was not Willy Messerschmitt, because technical achievement meant less than political access, because the men who controlled German aviation preferred promises to prototypes, potential to performance, connections to competence. The He-280 was real. It flew. It worked. It won. And they killed it anyway. The sound of those 8 Browning machine guns, the thunder of American Pratt & Whitney engines, the roar of thunderbolts diving out of the sun, these became the sounds of German defeat. They didn't have to be. There was another way. But the men who could have chosen it preferred to wait, to debate, to play politics while the future slipped away. By the time they realized their mistake, the future belonged to someone else. The He-280 sits in no museum, no restored example survives, no monument marks the airfield where it proved itself superior to every fighter Germany possessed. There is only the historical record, 9 prototypes, 37 flights, 1 demonstration that changed nothing. The world's first jet fighter. Built, proven, abandoned. The impossible jet Hitler never flew.